President Trump posted 7 words to Truth Social. The fraud investigation of California has begun. Within 72 hours, $5 billion in federal child care and social services funding to California gets frozen. Governor Newsom files a civil rights complaint against a federal appointee. And buried in the State Auditor's November report, an 11% error rate in CalFresh, exposing $2.5 billion in potential overpayments. This isn't political theater. This is a federal-state collision with real budget consequences. Here's what Sacramento isn't telling you. Look, I know you're exhausted. You're tired of the clickbait headlines that promise you the truth about California politics and then spend 10 minutes recycling the same partisan talking points you can get anywhere else. You're tired of channels that treat you like you need everything dumbed down or wrapped in outrage. That's not what we do here. If you want the legislative mechanics, the budget numbers, and the power moves that actually determine what happens to your taxes, your services, and your state, you're in the right place. So if that's the kind of intel you're looking for, hit that subscribe button right now. No games, no fluff, just the capital truth. Now let's get into it. This video is going to give you what the mainstream outlets won't touch: the actual legislative and fiscal mechanics behind these fraud allegations, not just the Trump versus Newsom soap opera. While cable news is replaying insult clips on a loop, we're tracking the real story: the budget exposure, the legal precedents from Minnesota's child care fraud cases, and what this means for California's fiscal cycle through 2028. Here's why you cannot afford to miss this. The core political threat is simple. If federal courts uphold these fund freezes, California loses all leverage in every future negotiation with Washington. This isn't about one investigation, it's about establishing a precedent where the executive branch can unilaterally withhold funds from states by labeling programs fraudulent without waiting for judicial review. That's a fundamental shift in the balance of power between federal and state governments. Our unique angle? We're connecting 3 dots the media keeps ignoring. First, California's own state auditor already flagged these exact same programs as high risk back in November 2025, before Trump ever posted anything. Second, the timing of Trump's announcement coincides perfectly with his broader immigration enforcement push, using welfare fraud narratives to justify ICE operations in blue states. Third, Newsom's counter strategy, filing civil rights complaints, updating his Trump criminals tracker, shows he's not actually defending the integrity of these programs. He's positioning himself for a 2028 presidential run. And here's your Mythbuster for today. The myth circulating is that California has zero fraud in these programs and Trump invented everything. The reality? California has already admitted to $1.5 billion in improper unemployment payments and has settled multiple hospice fraud cases. The real question isn't whether fraud exists, it's about scale and intent. Are we talking about isolated criminal networks that need to be prosecuted, or is Trump deliberately inflating numbers to justify dismantling federal-state partnerships entirely? We're going to separate confirmed fraud from political speculation using California's own audit data. Let's do it. So what exactly is Trump claiming? The administration is targeting 7 major California programs: hospice care, home health services, child care, welfare programs including EBT and CalFresh, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, and homeless services. Let me walk you through the actual evidence they're citing. In January 2026, Dr. Oz, yes, that Dr. Oz, now a federal appointee, releases a video alleging $3.5 billion in Los Angeles hospice fraud. He claims there are 42 hospice agencies operating in a single 4-block radius, and he describes them as fronts for what he calls the Russian-Armenian mafia. That's not subtle language, that's deliberate ethnic targeting that we'll come back to. Then you have the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services withholding $300 million in Medicaid payments to California. Their stated reason? Non-emergency care for illegals. Again, notice the language. They're tying healthcare fraud directly to immigration status. Next, the Trump administration freezes $5 billion in federal child care funding to California and 9 other states, alleging systemic fraud in oversight. And House Republicans start circulating the State Auditor's report that shows an 11% error rate in CalFresh. That's California's food stamp program, with $2.5 billion in exposure. They're also highlighting the $1.5 billion in improper unemployment payments that California already admitted to from the pandemic era. Now here's where it gets interesting. This isn't a spontaneous investigation that just appeared out of nowhere. The timing, January 6, 2026, comes right after Minnesota's Somali child care fraud cases made national headlines in late 2025. Trump is using Minnesota as a literal template. The playbook is identify fraud in one demographic group or one program category. Then expand the probe to justify broader immigration enforcement and fund clawbacks across multiple blue states. California isn't just a target. California is the scalable prototype. If this works in California, the biggest blue state with the most federal funding at stake, it works everywhere. That's the strategic calculation happening in the White House right now. But here's Newsom's problem, and this is what makes this story more complicated than the simple partisan narrative. Some of these allegations are actually backed by California's own auditors, so we need to separate facts from fiction. What does the audit data actually show? California's State Auditor released a report in November 2025 confirming that multiple programs are high risk. But the scale is dramatically different from what Trump is claiming. Let's go through the numbers. CalFresh, that's food stamps, shows an 11% error rate. Now, critical distinction here. An error rate is not the same as a fraud rate. Error rates include administrative mistakes, eligibility miscalculations, data entry problems. It's not all criminal activity. But that 11% represents $2.5 billion in potential exposure. However, actual fraud prosecutions are a tiny fraction of that number. Most of it is bureaucratic error that gets corrected through audits. Unemployment insurance, California admitted to $1.5 billion in improper pandemic-era payments between 2020 and 2021. Those were the emergency programs rushed out when everything shut down. The state claims it has since implemented reforms that reduced error rates by 40% as of 2025. We'll fact-check that claim against the Employment Development Department's latest fraud report, but that's what they're saying. Hospice fraud. This one's real. There are confirmed cases, including a $16 million scheme in Los Angeles that's already been prosecuted. And here's something critical. Newsom himself acknowledged in a November 2025 Health and Human Services briefing that hospice billing has known issues. So the governor's office wasn't denying fraud existed even before Trump made this a national story. Search EBT theft. State data shows EBT skimming. That's when criminals install card readers at stores to steal people's food stamp benefits, declined by 62% in 2025 after California rolled out chip-enabled cards. That's actually a success story, but it also confirms the problem was significant enough to require a statewide technology upgrade. So here's my analysis. The verified fraud exists. It's concentrated in specific programs. Hospice and pandemic unemployment are the big ones, but it's not systemic across all 7 categories Trump is targeting. What Trump is doing is bundling isolated criminal cases together with administrative errors to inflate the total dollar figure. Think about it this way. If you add up every potential CalFresh error, every unemployment overpayment, every hospice billing irregularity, and you present it as one giant fraud conspiracy, you can get to numbers that sound apocalyptic. But that's not how fraud actually works. Criminal fraud requires intent, organization, and prosecution. Administrative errors require better systems and oversight. They're not the same thing, but the Trump administration is treating them as if they are. The goal here isn't accuracy. The goal is creating a justification for federal takeover of state program oversight. If you can convince the public and the courts that California's government is systematically fraudulent, you can justify federal intervention at every level. Now let's talk about why Trump is escalating this particular fight at this particular moment. Because if the fraud is real but smaller than claimed, what's the strategic purpose? The answer is that fraud investigations are being weaponized for two other policy goals: immigration enforcement and blue state defunding. Look at the evidence. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services explicitly cites non-emergency care for illegals in their Medicaid payment hold. That language directly ties healthcare fraud to immigration status. It's not subtle. It's designed to blur the line between program integrity and immigration enforcement. Dr. Oz's video emphasizes the Russian-Armenian mafia and repeatedly focuses on immigrant communities in Los Angeles. Why? Because it primes public support for ICE raids in those exact neighborhoods. If you can convince voters that immigrant communities are running massive fraud operations, you build political cover for aggressive immigration enforcement actions. And look at which states are affected by the child care fund freeze. 10 states, all Democratic controlled. Now, Republican-led states have similar audit findings. Texas had significant unemployment fraud during the pandemic, but they face no comparable federal action. Zero. That's not a coincidence. That's selective enforcement based on political alignment. Here's the two-stage strategy I think we're seeing. Stage 1. Use fraud allegations to freeze funds and force states into federal compliance reviews. Stage 2. During those compliance reviews, federal agents gain access to state databases, DMV records, social services enrollment lists, healthcare program data, and that information gets cross-referenced for immigration enforcement purposes. California Attorney General Rob Bonta has already warned counties not to cooperate with what he calls ICE fishing expeditions. But the fraud probe gives federal authorities a legal entry point. They're not asking for immigration data directly, they're requesting program integrity audits, which happen to contain the same information. Newsom sees this coming, which is why his response isn't just legal, it's explicitly racial and political. On January 8, 2026, Newsom files a federal civil rights complaint against Dr. Oz personally, alleging racially charged targeting of Armenian communities without due process. That's a serious allegation. He's not just saying the investigation is wrong, he's saying it violates civil rights law by singling out ethnic communities for enforcement. Newsom's office also updates the Trump Criminals website. Yes, California maintains an actual website tracking this, listing pardoned fraudsters, including the Chrysleys and other white-collar criminals Trump has pardoned. The message is clear. Trump protects his cronies who committed actual financial crimes, but he targets immigrant communities in California over disputed program errors. California also joins a multi-state lawsuit challenging the child care fund freeze, arguing the Trump administration violated the Administrative Procedure Act by not providing proper notice or a comment period before taking action. That's a technical legal argument, but it matters because it challenges the executive branch's authority to act unilaterally. Now let me give you my analysis of Newsom's strategy, because I think there's something important happening beneath the surface. Newsom's approach is fundamentally defensive positioning for a 2028 presidential run. By framing Trump's fraud probe as racist and highlighting Trump's pardons of white-collar criminals, Newsom is building a specific narrative for Democratic primary voters. Trump protects wealthy white fraudsters, but targets working-class immigrant communities. That's a powerful story for the progressive base. The civil rights complaint won't actually stop the federal investigation. Civil rights cases take years to resolve, but it generates immediate national headlines and donor enthusiasm. Here's what I think is really happening. Newsom is not primarily defending the integrity of California's programs. If he were, he'd be rolling out comprehensive fraud prevention reforms, bringing in independent auditors, and demonstrating that California is cleaning house. Instead, he's fighting this entirely on political and racial grounds. That tells me he's more focused on his national political brand than on the substance of the fraud allegations. And look, that might be smart politics for his presidential ambitions, but it leaves California taxpayers in a vulnerable position if the courts side with Trump. Which brings us to the legal battlefield, because this is where the real fight is happening while everyone's distracted by the Twitter war. Federal courts are going to decide whether Trump can freeze funds without judicial review, and the precedent matters for every single state, not just California. On January 15, 2026, a federal judge issues a temporary restraining order on the Child Care Fund freeze. The judge requires the Trump administration to submit their compliance review findings within 30 days. That's significant because it means the court is saying you can't just freeze billions in funding based on accusations. You need to show your evidence, but temporary restraining orders are just that, temporary. The real question is what happens when the full hearing occurs? The legal precedent that matters here is South Dakota versus Dole from 1987. That Supreme Court case established that the federal government can condition funding on state compliance with federal requirements. But states are arguing the current freeze lacks clear notice of what the requirements actually are. You can't tell a state they're out of compliance if you never told them what compliance looks like in the first place. California has two legal paths forward. Path 1. Argue the freeze violates the Administrative Procedure Act, which requires notice, public comment, and a final rule before major federal actions. This is the stronger legal argument, but it's slower, could take 6 to 12 months to work through the courts. Path 2. Argue it violates the 10th Amendment, which reserves powers to the states and limits federal overreach into state program administration. This is a weaker legal argument because of that South Dakota versus Dole precedent, but it generates huge political momentum because it frames this as a states' rights issue that even some conservatives might support. My expectation is that California will pursue both arguments simultaneously while also negotiating behind closed doors. And here's why the negotiation matters. If Trump offers California a compliance deal, for example, implement stricter verification systems, allow federal auditors access to your databases, and will resume funding, Newsom faces an impossible choice. If he accepts, he looks weak to his progressive base and he's giving Trump exactly what he wants: access to state data. If he rejects the deal, California risks losing billions in cuts and Newsom gets blamed for choosing political posturing over program funding. That's a genuine dilemma with no clean answer. The Department of Justice has also appointed a new Assistant Attorney General specifically for fraud cases as of January 2026. This signals that criminal investigations into hospice and Medicaid providers are coming. Those investigations will likely result in indictments, probably in the next 60 to 90 days. And here's what to watch for. If those indictments come with high-profile arrests in immigrant communities, if we see perp walks on the news of people with Armenian or Russian last names being let out in handcuffs, that validates Trump's narrative in the eyes of millions of voters. It doesn't matter if those arrests represent a tiny fraction of the program's total activity. The visual imagery of fraud arrests in immigrant communities becomes the story, and it justifies everything Trump has claimed. Now let's talk about what California actually loses if Trump wins this legal fight, because the fiscal impact is staggering. $5 billion in frozen childcare and social services funds represents 8% of California's discretionary social services budget. That's not a rounding error, that's a massive chunk. The $300 million in Medicaid holds affects county hospitals and community clinics, many of which were already operating on razor-thin margins after the pandemic. And California's current budget is already projecting a $68 billion deficit through 2028. Losing federal funds doesn't just create a hole, it accelerates the entire deficit timeline. If California loses in court, Newsom has 3 realistic options, and all of them are politically toxic. Option 1, cut programs. You start eliminating services, reducing eligibility, closing offices. That's political suicide in an election year, and it destroys any chance Newsom has at a 2028 presidential run. How do you run for president as the governor who cut food assistance and childcare? Option 2, raise state taxes. But California is already at the limit of what voters will tolerate. You got Proposition 13 restrictions on property taxes, you've had multiple tax increase measures on recent ballots, and voter fatigue is real. Plus, if you raise taxes to replace federal funding that was cut because of fraud allegations, You're essentially asking taxpayers to cover the cost of fraud. That's a brutal sell. Option 3. Borrow from reserves or reallocate from other programs. California has a rainy day fund of about $24 billion, but that money is specifically earmarked for recession protection. It's not supposed to be used for political battles with the federal government. If you drain the rainy day fund and then the economy turns south, California has no cushion. But here's the nightmare scenario that keeps Sacramento up at night. It's not just the $5 billion freeze, it's Trump using this precedent to target transportation funding next, then education grants, then disaster relief money. If the legal principle gets established that the executive branch can freeze any funding based on allegations of fraud or non-compliance without waiting for courts to adjudicate, California becomes fiscally dependent on federal political whims. Every program, every grant, every funding stream becomes subject to presidential approval or disapproval based on California's cooperation with federal policy. That's not federalism anymore, that's financial coercion. And this brings us to the fourth possibility, the one that political analysts are starting to whisper about in private conversations, and it's the most dangerous scenario of all. What this means for other blue states. Because if Trump's California strategy succeeds, every Democratic governor in America is watching. New York is already under federal scrutiny for Medicaid managed care fraud. Subpoenas went out in December 2025. Illinois is facing audits of its child care program after the Minnesota cases, and Trump allies in Congress are now proposing something called the Welfare Integrity Act, which would mandate quarterly state audits and authorize federal fund holds pending review. That's not about California anymore. That's a permanent framework for federal control over state social programs. This is a stress test for federalism itself. If Trump can freeze California funds without final court approval, he establishes an executive branch precedent to financially pressure any state that defies federal policy on anything: immigration, environmental regulations, voting laws, you name it. Democratic governors are watching California extremely closely right now. If Newsom folds and accepts a compliance deal, every other blue state governor loses leverage in their own negotiations with the federal government. But if Newsom wins and the courts block Trump's fund freezes, it emboldens state resistance, which will likely trigger even harsher federal retaliation. We're talking about transportation fund clawbacks, disaster relief delays, federal contracts being awarded to other states. The California fight isn't just about whether fraud exists in hospice programs, it's about whether states retain fiscal autonomy or become subsidiaries of federal political priorities. So where does this actually end? Let me give you the 30-day and 90-day scenarios based on the current trajectory. In the next 30 days, watch for 3 specific developments. Development number 1, the federal court ruling on the child care fund freeze. If that temporary restraining order becomes a permanent injunction, Trump loses round 1 and California keeps the funding while the legal case proceeds. That's a win for Newsom in the short term, but if the restraining order is lifted and the freeze is allowed to continue, you're going to see immediate program cuts across California. Child care centers will start closing, waiting lists will explode, and low-income families will lose access to subsidized care. That becomes the visible human cost of this political battle. Development number 2, Department of Justice criminal indictments in Los Angeles hospice cases. If those indictments come down with arrests of individuals in Armenian immigrant communities, it completely validates Trump's narrative in the public mind. Suddenly, it's not just allegations, it's prosecutions with mugshots and court documents. That shifts public opinion significantly, even among California voters who are generally skeptical of Trump. People see arrests, they see fraud charges, and they think maybe there's something to this. That's when Newsom's political strategy becomes much harder to sustain. Development number 3, California's February budget revision. Newsom is required by law to submit an updated budget proposal by February 15, 2026. That's just days away. As of this recording, watch what he does. If Newsom reallocates state funds to replace the frozen federal dollars, that tells you he's preparing for a prolonged legal and political fight. He's saying, we're not backing down, we'll fund these programs with state money while we fight this in court. But if the budget revision doesn't include replacement funding, that means one of two things. Either he expects to win in court quickly and get the federal money released, or he's negotiating a behind-the-scenes deal with the Trump administration. Either way, that February 15th budget document is going to tell us everything about Sacramento's actual strategy versus their public rhetoric. Looking out 90 days, the scenarios get more complex. If California wins the initial court battles, Trump has the option to escalate through administrative actions that don't require court approval. Things like increased IRS audits of California nonprofits that administer these programs, EPA reviews of California's environmental waivers, or transportation department delays on infrastructure grants. None of those require freezing funds outright, but they all create administrative burdens and financial pressure that accomplish the same goal. If Trump wins the court battles, you're looking at a cascade effect across every blue state. Governors will start preemptively implementing stricter verification systems and allowing federal audits just to avoid being the next target. That's Trump achieving policy goals without Congress passing a single law, just through the credible threat of fund freezes. The wild card in all of this is public opinion in California itself. Right now, California voters are roughly split along partisan lines on this issue. Democrats largely see it as political persecution of their state. Republicans see it as legitimate fraud enforcement, and independents are somewhere in the middle trying to figure out what's real and what's exaggerated. But if we start seeing more fraud prosecutions with real evidence, or if program cuts start affecting middle-class families who lose child care subsidies, that public opinion can shift quickly. Newsom's approval rating in California is already underwater. He's been below 50% for most of the past year. If voters start blaming him for losing federal funds because he's fighting with Trump instead of fixing the actual fraud problems, that becomes a serious political liability. Here's the bottom line, and this is what actually matters for California residents trying to understand how this affects your daily life. This is not a simple fraud investigation. It's a coordinated federal effort to use verified but limited fraud cases as justification for broad fund freezes, compliance reviews, and potential immigration enforcement access to state databases. So California's own auditors confirm real problems in hospice billing and CalFresh error rates. Those aren't invented, but the problems are not at the scale Trump is claiming, and they're being bundled together with political motivations that have nothing to do with program integrity. Newsom's counterattack is politically strategic for his 2028 presidential ambitions, but it's legally uncertain whether it will actually protect California's funding. And if the courts rule in Trump's favor and these freezes become permanent, California is looking at billions in budget cuts or tax increases. Those cuts will hit the programs that serve the most vulnerable populations: child care for low-income working families, home health services for elderly and disabled residents, food assistance for people living in poverty. The fraud is real. The politics are real, but the larger consequence, federal control over state program funding based on executive branch discretion, is the real threat to California's fiscal independence. This isn't about whether Trump is right or Newsom is right. It's about whether the federal government can unilaterally defund state programs without going through proper legal process, and what that means for the balance of power in our federal system. So what do you need to watch in the next 30 days? 3 things. Number 1, that federal court ruling on the child care fund freeze. If the temporary restraining order becomes permanent, Trump loses leverage and California keeps fighting with federal dollars flowing. If it gets lifted, you're going to see immediate real-world impacts in communities across California. But number 2, Department of Justice criminal indictments in Los Angeles. If we see arrests with actual evidence of organized fraud, it changes the narrative completely. Suddenly, this isn't just political theater, it's validated law enforcement action. That's when public opinion shifts and Newsom's strategy becomes much harder to sustain. Number 3, California's February budget revision on February 15th. Watch whether Newsom reallocates state funds to replace frozen federal dollars. If he does, he's preparing for a prolonged fight. If he doesn't, he's either expecting a court win or he's quietly negotiating with the Trump administration behind closed doors. This is the California power shift you need to understand. Not the insults on social media, not the cable news shouting matches, but the actual legal and fiscal mechanisms that determine whether your state government has autonomy or becomes financially dependent on federal political approval. That's the story. That's what matters. If you want this kind of analysis on every major California policy fight, the budget battles, the legislative maneuvering, the federal-state collisions that actually affect your taxes and your services, this is the channel that breaks it down before the mainstream outlets figure it out. No fluff, no partisan talking points, just the legislative intel and power dynamics that keep you ahead of what's coming. Subscribe right now if that's valuable to you. And next video, we're covering California's February budget revision and the hidden tax increases that are getting buried in trailer bills while everyone's distracted by the fraud headlines. You're not going to want to miss that breakdown because those tax increases will hit your wallet directly and most people won't see them coming. I'll see you in that next video. Thanks for watching.